My name is Jonathan Williams. Today I'm interviewing Gary Stork, April 11, 2017, at the Sparta Public Library in Sparta, Illinois. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Walsh, Illinois on September the 30th, 1947.
Who are your parents and what are their occupations?
My father is deceased, and his name was Harold Stark, and he was a guard at the Chester Mental Health and also a farmer. And my mother was Elizabeth Stork, and she's deceased also, and she was a stay-home mom, raised 6 kids.
Do you have any siblings? If so, what are their names and genders?
I do. Okay, I have 4 sisters, and their name is Ruth Ann, was the oldest sister, and she's deceased now. And then there was Iva Jean Beatty, and she's married to Carl Beatty. And did you ask me how old they were, or no?
No, sir.
No. Okay. And then there was Benita. She lives in Percy. And then my brother Jack, he lives in Jerseyville, Illinois. And then my youngest sister Darla, and she lives in Steelville.
Has any served in the military?
None.
So you was the only person to go in the military out of your siblings?
Yes, sir.
Do you still keep in touch with your siblings?
Yes, sir.
What were you doing before you joined the service?
Having a lot of fun because I was so young. I was 18 when I was drafted, but I had a job at the steel mill in Granite City whenever I got my letter.
And what year did you join the service?
In 1967, June of 1967.
How long did you serve?
2 years. I was drafted.
What made you want to go to the service?
Nothing. I really didn't want to go to the service. I'm glad I did now, but at the time, no, I never enlisted. They came and got me.
Where were you living when you joined the service?
Granite City.
In which branch of the military did you serve?
Army.
Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I was drafted.
What happened when you departed for training camp and during your early days of training?
I would say that I was homesick pretty bad, which was it's a weird feeling that comes over you whenever you're away from home, and they treat you like you think they're treating you pretty badly whenever you first go in. And so I would say homesickness was the hardest thing on me. And when I got drafted, they sent me to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
What are some things you guys did at training camp?
Mostly running, and we shot our rifles, and just normal, trying to build your bodies up and get your brains washed out. So you did what you were told, in other words. And then they sent us on I got orders for infantry training down in Fort Polk, Louisiana, and there it was more combat training and tactical training on what to do in a war zone.
Do you recall your instructors? If so, what were they like?
I don't recall their names at all, but they were meant to be really mean to you. I don't think they was that bad of people. They just that was their job. They were drill sergeants.
Did you have like any type of bond with any of your instructors?
No.
What did you think of basic training?
Again, the only thing that I remembered much about my basic training was the homesickness, and pretty well got over that after they moved me out of basic training.
What was the worst part of boot camp?
I guess the fact that you had to get up and before daylight, and you had to run until you was totally exhausted, and you never got enough food.
Did you receive any specialized training? If so, what kind of training?
Yes, after my basic training, then I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana for my infantry training. And then after the infantry training, I was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for some leadership training. And at the end of that training in Georgia, they promoted me to Sergeant E5. And then I became a drill sergeant in South Carolina and trained troops to go to Vietnam.
How was it like to train troops?
Well, you had to be a bad guy. You didn't want to be a bad guy because it wasn't too many weeks earlier and you was being the one that was being bad too. So, but you still had to do your job, and your job was to really break them down and then build them back up again, mentally.
How did you adapt to the military life, including the physical remain, barracks, and food and social life?
The food was a big problem because I never could get enough of it. They kept you so active that you was hungry constantly. They kept you on a pretty steady diet. I didn't weigh much. Probably I weighed about 130 pounds when I went into the Army. And during my training and time as a drill sergeant, I did get myself up to 165 pounds. But there was a lot of sneaking food whenever I was in basic and AIT. You'd go out at night and try to find somewhere on base where they were selling pizzas or hoagie sandwiches or something like that.
Where did you serve?
Well, I started in Fort Benning, Georgia. No, I started in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, then went to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and then went to Fort Benning, Georgia, and then went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and then got my orders for Vietnam to report to Fort Dix, New Jersey, where the plane picked us up and took us away.
What was your first impression of it?
Of what? The Army?
Yes, sir.
Well, at first I hated it, and then I got to where after enough schooling and I started getting into it to where I felt like that I could do some good in Vietnam and was ready to be there and see what I could do.
What are some memories or experiences of the Army?
Well, I guess when I said that I wanted to, after training, I felt as though I was ready to go over and make a difference because I felt like I was one of the best in what I did, and I could lead men into combat. I could read maps. It isn't the same as the maps here in the United States or elevation maps, and I could call artillery in. I had a little medical training so that if some of the men got wounded, I'd have to use that, and which I did. And then whenever I got to, when I got to Vietnam, they put us in a large company. It was called the 90th Replacement Unit, and we were there for replacements. Any infantry unit that needed, they were all infantry men, and any infantry unit that needed reinforcements, then we went there, and that was our permanent duty. And that's where I was there about 3 days, and they assigned me to the Americal Division, the 196th Infantry, up by Chu Lai. So I went up there, and you want me to continue on with that part of the interview?
Yeah.
Okay, and so they get me up in July, and they give me a rifle. I went to the 196th Quonset hut. They gave me a rifle, and the stock was cracked in it, and I complained about that. I said, this thing's broken. And I said, the 198th, I seen them over there giving their soldiers brand new rifles, and here you're giving me one that's cracked. And the guy that handed it to me was just a private, but he come back with a pretty good one-liner. He said, yours has been tested, theirs haven't. So I thought that was pretty hilarious. And then I took the rifle because that's what they gave me it, and I did get it replaced before the year was out. But then they took me to a fire base by helicopter, and I was sitting at that fire base. And it was an artillery fire base, and they were firing artillery and mortar rounds, and they said whenever they resupplied my company that I would be on that chopper. And there was choppers coming in, and they were loading up supplies and going out to different infantry units. And one of the guys that was shooting the artillery said, where are you headed, Sergeant? And I said, I'm going to the 196th Infantry. And he said, we're firing support for them now. They're kind of in a hot zone. So I sat there and I started getting sick at my stomach. And it was like 112 degrees, and I was leaned up against some sandbags. And everybody that went by said, Sergeant, you need to take a salt pill. So I'd take some salt pills and I'd throw them right back up. And it wasn't the fact that I was overheated, it was I was getting scared, because I didn't know it at the time, but that's what it was. I was just scared, knowing that sooner or later I'd be in the combat. So then they came up and told me that they were loading the chopper for my company. And so I went over to the chopper, and the door gunner came down and he said, they're running low on ammo, they're in a hot zone, we're going to fly over, and we want you to kick out the supplies, and then we'll see whether we can take you in or not. We're not landing with the supplies. So okay. So I sat there, and we started out, and we got over a ways, and all of a sudden the door gunners on both sides, they started firing, and you could hear bullets hitting the bottom of the chopper. And then whenever he nodded for me to kick out, I kicked out the ammo, and there was a big pile of it, and I kicked it all out, and they took off, and I thought, well, boy, we're going back to the fire base. And then he gets out of his pedestal, and he steps over there, and he said, we're going to bring you back. We're going to get you as low as we can. You sit on the side of the chopper, and when I nod to you, you jump. And so, okay, so I get on the side of the chopper, and I got my legs on the pedestals, and we come in, and the door gunners start firing again, and you could hear the bullets hitting the bottom of the chopper. And I brought my legs back up off of that, and he'd stop shooting and looked at me. And I put my legs back out there again, because you can't hardly jump when you're not on the pedestal. So then finally they got down there, and there was grass starting to, the runners was hitting the grass, and I thought, well, they're going to land. He nodded, and I jumped. I thought I was jumping this far, and when in fact we was in elephant grass, and I guess I probably went down 9 to 10 feet. When I hit the ground, it knocked out my wind. When you're not expecting to jump that far, and you do, it really is quite a jolt. So now I'm on the ground, and the chopper's leaving, and he's still firing, and I could hear grenade launchers being set off, and that was the men in my company that was, because they were in a hot zone. And this guy comes crawling through this elephant grass, and he's real skinny looking thing, and he's got captain bars on the front of his helmet. And when he gets up to me, he says, oh, a sergeant. He said, we're really short of sergeants out here. And when he crawled over to me, because there was bullets coming through the elephant grass, so I mean we were definitely under attack. And he started pulling my sergeant stripes off my arm, and he said, you won't live throughout the day with them stripes on you, because a sniper sees them stripes, you're gone. So while he was pulling the bars off of my sleeves, I was pulling the threads out, because I thought maybe they got a scope and they might see the threads where the stripes were sewed on. So then there I was with the 196th Infantry, so that was quite the welcome. When I knew right away that I wanted to go back home at that time. I didn't feel like I wanted to make a difference when you're in grass, it's that far over your head and bullets are flying through there, that I didn't see nothing. I couldn't see any further from me to you. So that was my first experience.
What is one thing you'll always remember about the Army?
Well, it's a good branch of the service. I think it's the best. You can talk to the rest and they'll probably say different, but you should be proud of the branch that you was in. But the good thing about the Army was I can't tell you anything good about it, really.
What kind of friendships did you form while serving, and with who?
Well, there was one guy, and his name was Al Turcano, and he was from Steelville. He went into basic training with me. He went into my infantry training at Fort Polk. He was a drill sergeant with me in South Carolina. Got his orders for Vietnam the same time I did. And we reported to Fort Dix and flew to Vietnam together, and the only time we was ever separated was he got the 9th Infantry Division when I got the Marical Division. So, but Al had told me down in Fort Benning, Georgia, he started reading the Bible, and he said to me, "Do you think you're coming back from Vietnam?" Because we knew we were going to Vietnam. And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yes, I do. I said, "We're a couple of country boys. We shoot squirrels, we shoot rabbits. 6 months tops, if the U.S. government can keep us in bullets, we'll have all them dead." And he said, "Well, as confident as you are, I'm just as confident I won't make it." And Al made it until August the 8th. So we got there. We probably seen combat together on the 1st of July, and so he didn't make it very long. So he knew that he wasn't going to make it, and I knew I was. So I guess you already know that before you ever get there. So that's one guy, but the rest of the people, all the men that I was with in Vietnam, I can't remember none of their names. I can't remember my leaders' names, nor can I remember my squad members' names. Somehow or another, that got washed out of my brain. Probably for the best.
How did you stay in touch with family and friends back home?
I wrote letters. Tried to write letters every day when I could, and I wrote to my mom and my brothers and sisters and my wife. I had got married in November after I had joined the Army in June. I married my sweetheart from school that I had dated since she was a freshman. So, yeah, that's the only way I communicated, except I did call my wife on a handheld radio through ham operators to tell her that I was going to Hawaii for my rest, and after you serve six months over there, you got a week off. You couldn't go home, but you could go to places like Hawaii. So that's where I elected to go, and I contacted her and said, "Meet me there," and she did. And that was the only other communications besides letters. There was no such thing as cell phones at the time.
What did you do for recreation or when you were off duty?
You never were really off duty. in Vietnam. And I was in training the whole time that I was in the States. So with just a 2-year hitch, it was just training and then it was the war zone. And you wrote letters, I guess is what you could say when you could, but that would come little bits at a time. Maybe you'd get 10 minutes here or whatever.
What did you think of the people you served with?
Well, I think I served with a lot of very brave individuals that believed we were doing the right thing while we was there. So yeah, good people.
What was the highest rank you ever achieved?
I was a sergeant E5, squad leader.
How did you get to be that?
I went to that leadership training in Fort Benning, Georgia, and they took the tops of the class and promoted them to sergeants. And I was one of them, and so was Al Turcano.
What combat action did you witness?
A lot, just a lot. I was with the 196th Infantry for 7 months, and then at the end of the 7 months, it was kind of unique. I was on ambush that night, and the sergeants everything was transmitted in code, and the sergeants knew what the code was, and what the codes was one day it would be like +5, the next day it might be -2, and what that was the alphabet. They spelled each thing out letter for letter. Then when you wrote it down, then you had to break the code by saying if it was A, if it was +5, you would have to go A, B, C, D, E, and put down an E. That's actually what they wanted you to, if you follow how the code worked. Well, while I was on ambush, I had this blanket. I would throw it over my head, and I was writing this down. I could do that without light, but then but in that message that they was given through, they said tomorrow, when the supply chopper comes in, Sergeant Gary Stork's replacement will be on it and have him on that chopper. We're pulling him back. And I was just so excited that I couldn't hardly wait till daylight. And then they brought me, and I got on the chopper. They took me back to the Saigon area and sent me to school to speak Vietnamese. And it was a 3-week school. At the end of that 3 weeks, I couldn't speak Vietnamese or English. They had totally wiped out my vocabulary totally. I thought it was a real waste of time. But then they made me an advisor and put me with the South Vietnamese Infantry, which was actually worse than being with the Americans. But that schooling, I couldn't speak Vietnamese, but I could understand Vietnamese. So it was very valuable school that they sent me through to be an advisor, and that's what I served as an advisor until my year was up.
How did you feel when witnessing casualties and destruction?
At start, it was very hard on me, but then being a sergeant with the medical training that I had, and sergeants carried 5 tubes of morphine. Each sergeant had 5 tubes of morphine, the soldiers had none. So when somebody got wounded or stepped on a booby trap or something like that, the only medical attention they got until the chopper got there was their sergeants, because in the movies they had medics, but I never seen a medic in Vietnam. Maybe some infantry units had medics, but the 196th Infantry, we did not have no medics. So we were the medics. So after a while, you got very seasoned to that. My procedure was always the same. I went up, popped them through the pants with a tube of morphine. I lit up a cigarette and gave them a cigarette. If they smoked or not, they smoked that cigarette. The first question they always asked me was, am I going to get to go home? You never said yes, even if they had lost a leg or something like that. You would say, oh no. In 3 weeks tops, you'll be back out here. You'll be fighting alongside of me again. Because if you told them they were going home, then they would go into shock, because then their next question, am I going to live? Sometimes I knew they weren't going to live, but I still, the same thing, popped them with the morphine, lit up the cigarette, told them in 3 weeks you're going to be back out here. And that's about it.
How did your experience in war affect your life?
I would say it affected a lot. My wife and my kids could tell you more, but I probably think about Vietnam every day.
Were you ever wounded?
No.
How long did you serve on the front lines?
A year.
What were the living conditions like on the front lines?
Pretty rough. Pretty rough. You never, the only time you bathed was if it rained or if you found a stream or something like that. There was no showers. There was no toilets. You had your entrenching tool and you dug a hole in the ground and you covered it back up. Maybe you didn't, but the clothes that you wore, they would never wash. They would rot off of you, and they would bring out brand new stuff. Nothing that was sent to you was ever used. It was always brand new, and they bring them out, and whether they fit you or not, you put them on and you wore them until they rotted off, which didn't take long. Usually in about 7 days, with that rain, the humidity, and all the walking that the infantry does, it was, your clothes didn't last long, neither did your boots.
Are there some memories you would like to talk about the Vietnam War?
There was one that was kind of hilarious, I guess you could say. I don't know if you'd say it that way, but I was with the South Vietnamese infantry, and there was always 2 Americans with them. And we were crossing a rice paddy, and the enemy had us pinned down in that rice paddy, and we just couldn't move. It was just, if you stuck your head up past that rice paddy dike, there was bullets hitting that dike. So I was on the radio trying to call in some kind of support, assistance of some kind, and I was way down in the Delta at this time, and there was many Americans down there at Tall. And this pilot came on the radio, and he said he could hear me. So I gave him my coordinates where I was at, and here he come flying over, and he was flying a plane similar to that you see every day that flies in and out of the airport here, just a fixed wing prop, a single engine plane. And he said, I probably can't do you much good. He said, I've got 2 rockets left, and I'm running low on fuel. And so I told him that there was a tree line, and I threw out a smoke grenade so he could see the smoke. He said the smoke, and I identified that was the color, because the enemy, a lot of times when he would say pop smoke, they would throw out smoke. That really confused everybody. So at least the colors, we had all different colors. So he come flying over, and then he went in behind us, and he came over the top of us pretty low, and about the time I told him where the tree line was from where we were, and he let loose one of them rockets, and when it hit the tree line, trees was flying up. Them things are pretty darn powerful. And boy, the shooting just stopped. I mean, it just quit. And so we started to stand up, and there was no return fire. So I said, I don't know whether you got them or you just scared the heck out of them, but you did the job. And he said, well, I got one more rocket. I'll just come and let it off too. And so he did. He did the same thing again and moved over a little bit, and bang, he hit them trees again. So then he said to me, he said, well, I'm going to go back and get me a cold beer. And I said to him on the radio, I said, I've been out here for 8 days. I've been drinking water out of the bomb craters or rice paddy. And if I thought you had a cold beer in that airplane right now, I would shoot you down. And I laughed, and he laughed, and away he went. About 40 minutes later, that same guy was on the radio again, wanted to know if we were doing okay. I said, yeah, we're doing fine. We haven't hit anything else. He said, well, I'm fully loaded. I've got six rockets on board. And I said, well, we're good to go. And so here he came. You could see him. He's flying. Well, he asked me where I was from my last coordinates, and I did tell him. And here he come, pretty low in the rice paddy. It was kind of funny because the South Vietnamese, they didn't know what he was doing, and they was kind of, they got down because they thought he might be going to fire a rocket or something. So he flies over and he makes a big loop like a crop duster does, and here he comes back over, and when he came over the first time, he put his arm out the window and he was waving, and I waved back, and then he turns and comes over, and he throws out of the airplane, and it hit the water. And I went over there and stuck my fingers down, and when my fingers touched it, I mean, it was down in the mud of the rice paddy. When my fingers touched it, it was ice cold. And I pulled it up out of there, and it was a beer. I couldn't tell you what kind it was, because for one, it was all covered in mud, and they didn't have the Papa Tops back then. You had to open them with what we call the old church key, and every infantry soldier had that on his dog tags because you never was left home without that. So I opened that up, and I drank that beer, and it was the best beer I ever had in my whole life. I've never had one as good since, and I've been drinking a bunch of them all the time to just see if I could find that taste of that best beer. But no, that was a friend that I had that I'll never know his name. I can't even tell you if he was Air Force or he was Army or Navy or what he was, but he was my best friend that day. So that's a little humor in it.
Have you ever been shot at before?
Oh yes, lots of times.
Where were you when your period of service was up?
I was in Vietnam. They had taken me to, when I came back from Vietnam, I was out of the Army. They flew me into California and gave me my discharge papers.
How did you return home?
From Vietnam, they flew into Hawaii, the Philippines, Hawaii, and then California. And they gave me my discharge papers in California, and then I got me a plane ticket to St. Louis. And my wife picked me up there, and my mom and dad.
What have you done since separating from the military?
I did a lot of things. I went back to the steel mill when I first got back, and then from there I got a job at the Sparta post office and I delivered mail, and I worked there about 6 years, and then I bought a business in Chester. It was a fuel distributor business, and I quit the post office and did that. And then I bought a farm in 1981, and I still live there on that farm today. But then I opened up a trucking company, and I had 15 employees, and I sold that business in 2001, and I'm presently retired.
What message would you like to leave for future generations who will view this interview?
Well, I guess I think that just don't always respect a veteran, because you don't know what they've done for this country. You really do know what they've done for this country, but always respect a veteran.
Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed or should be added to this interview?
No, sir.
This concludes our interview. Thank you for taking part in this interview, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.